Widowed mother of 10 with newborn twins on top. A bachelor preacher baptized all 12 before sundown. The first thing I noticed was the axle. Not the woman. Not the 10 children arranged on the road like fence posts in a high wind. Not the 2 bundles she was holding against her chest. One to each side, arms crooked, face rigid with the particular stillness of someone who has been awake for 3 days and stopped feeling the weight of things because they have no choice. I noticed the axle because I've broken 3 in my life, and I know the sound a wagon makes when it settles wrong after one goes, that low wooden sigh, like the whole vehicle has accepted something bad. I heard it before I crested the rise. By the time I saw them, she was already standing in the road beside a Conestoga tilted hard to the left, rear wheel in the ditch up to its hub, the sun coming flat and mean off the alkali flats to the west. I pulled up my mule. That was Deuteronomy. He had opinions about stopping and expressed them, as always, by doing nothing whatsoever faster than he intended to. I said, "You need help." She said, "I'm managing." She was not managing. One of the older boys, maybe 12, maybe 14, hard to say. Children who work age differently than children who don't, was up to his hips in the ditch with his shoulder against the undercarriage and the look of a person who has already tried this 4 times. A girl about 10 stood at the rear holding a plank she clearly meant to use as a lever, waiting for a signal that was not coming from anyone. 3 smaller ones sat on a rock by the road, sharing what looked like a strip of dried beef the length of my finger between them. A boy about 4 was asleep in the back of the wagon with his mouth open. 2 more girls I counted near the front wheel, and 1 boy standing with a rope tied to the harness of the lead horse doing, I could not determine what exactly. The 2 bundles against her chest were making small sounds. Twins, newborn, from the look of the cloths, red-faced. She had them pinned against her with the specific expertise of a woman who has learned to do this so that her hands remain technically free. I stepped down off Deuteronomy. He made a sound. "I'm Elia's cutter," I said. "I ride circuit for the Reformed congregation out of Harlan's Crossing. I have no personal investment in whether you accept my help, but I do have a rope, a second mule I'm trailing, and approximately 4 hours before the temperature drops to something that will be unpleasant for those 2. She looked at me the way you look at a bill of sale before you sign it, reading for the clause that will cost you something you didn't intend to give. "Preacher," she said, it was not a question. It was a category. She was filing me under something. "When required," I said. She looked at the boys in the ditch, at the tilted wagon, at the plank her daughter was still holding with both hands. Then she looked at the twins. "Eleanor Marsh," she said. "The children are mine. The wagon is a problem. The horse is Calder and he has a glass eye on the left, and you'll want to know that before you try to lead him." She paused. "I'm grateful for the rope." That was how it began. I want to tell it straight because it doesn't make sense if you try to tell it neat. The following 12 hours or so refused to arrange themselves into a tidy shape in my memory, and I have long since stopped trying to make them. What I remember comes in the order it struck me, not in the order it happened, and I've learned that's the only honest way to give it. So, what I remember first is the weight of the wagon. The 2 older boys, the one in the ditch was named Samuel, the one with the rope was Thomas, and I worked the rear wheel out in about 40 minutes. It should have taken 20, but the left rear spoke was cracked, not broken, and I had to decide whether to splint it or leave it, and I decided to splint it, and it took longer than I thought. Eleanor stood in the road the whole time holding those twins. I offered twice to take one. She said no both times in a voice that did not invite a third offer, so I didn't make one. The boy asleep in the back of the wagon did not wake up during any of this. He was 6. His name was Caleb. I would learn later he had a habit of sleeping through noise that would wake a grown man, a talent his mother considered both a gift and an occasional problem. Once the wagon was up and rolling again, I thought that was probably the end of my involvement. It wasn't. Eleanor Marsh was heading to a homestead claim 22 miles north of where I'd found her. She had a deed. She had a survey marker. She had a letter from the county land office that she kept in her dress, in the same place women keep the things they cannot afford to lose. What she did not have was any clear sense of the road from this point forward, because the man who had drawn her the map had drawn it in December, and in June the creek crossings were different. I knew the country. I rode circuit through it 4 times a year. I knew where the second crossing was fordable in June and where it wasn't. I knew the ranch that would sell water at a fair price and the one that wouldn't. I knew the cutoff that saved 6 miles and the reason most people didn't know about it, which was that a man named Hollowell had put his fence across it 3 years ago and people had stopped trying. I'd had occasion to discuss that fence with Hollowell on 2 separate visits, and on the second visit we had reached an understanding. The fence now had a gate, and the gate was unlocked. So I rode with them. This is the part that doesn't make sense if you try to explain it as a simple decision. I had places to be. I had congregants in Hardesty who were waiting for a Sunday service. I had a letter in my saddlebag from Reverend Aldous Pyle in Harlan's Crossing asking me to account for my movements over the previous month, and implying, with the particular gentleness of a man who has authority over you, that I had been spending too much time in the Northern Territory, and not enough time where the money came from. I had a mule named Deuteronomy who had made his feelings about additional mileage clear in terms I cannot fully translate, but whose general tone was unmistakable. None of that mattered. I want to be plain about this, because I've heard men tell a story like this and make it into something it wasn't, some grand choice, some sacrifice, some proof of their own goodness they're very interested in your noticing. That's not what happened. What happened was I looked at that wagon full of children, at that woman in the road with 2 newborns pinned against her ribs like she was the only thing holding them together, and it did not feel like a choice. It felt like the thing in front of me. You do the thing in front of you. I rode with them. Her husband's name had been Clarence. He died in February, 6 weeks before the twins were born. Heart, the doctor said, though Alina said he'd been working too hard since the previous autumn, and she'd seen it coming in the way his breath changed when he climbed stairs, and the way he'd stopped mentioning next year's planting. She said this plainly, the way you say a thing you've already finished grieving as much as you're going to grieve it on a moving wagon in front of a preacher you just met. I asked her, and I don't know exactly why I asked it. It wasn't idle, whether she'd had time to bury him properly. She was quiet for a moment. The twins were both asleep against her now. The wagon creaked. I had time, she said. The children dug. That was all she said about it, and I did not ask again. The claim was Clarence's idea, she told me. He'd read about the territory in a pamphlet. She had not been persuaded and had said so plainly more than once, and in the end she had gone because he was her husband and she believed in him even when she didn't believe in the pamphlet. Now he was in the ground in Missouri, and she was on a road she couldn't read heading for a piece of land she'd never seen with 10 children, 12 now, the twins having arrived while she was still in Missouri, which had delayed the departure and changed the arithmetic of everything. Is it a good claim? I asked. I don't know, she said. I'll find out. I believed her completely. There was no bravado in it. It was the flattest statement of fact I'd heard in some time. We made camp that night 2 miles short of the first crossing. Alina managed the camp the way I have seen sergeants manage a bivouac, without visible effort, through a sequence of signals so practiced they were barely signals anymore, just a direction of her attention and children moving. Samuel unhitched the horses. Thomas gathered wood. The girl who'd held the plank, her name was Ruth, she was 11, started a fire with 1 match in a wind I'd have bet against. 3 smaller ones, I was still sorting out who was who, and I will get to that, set up the bedrolls. The boy named Caleb woke up from wherever he'd been and joined without being asked, which told me he'd done this before. The twins she laid in a padded box in the back of the wagon that I later learned Clarence had built for exactly this purpose, on the understanding, when he'd built it, that there would be 1 child. Alina had lined it with wool and a piece of oilcloth against the damp. It was a good piece of carpentry. I looked at it longer than I should have. Clarence had built it for one, and here it held 2, side by side, and that felt like something, though I couldn't have said what exactly. I made coffee. It was the most useful thing I had to offer at that particular moment, and I knew it. Alina accepted a cup without ceremony. She drank it black and fast, like someone who intends coffee to be medicine and not an occasion. You have a first name, she said. It was not quite a question. Elias. Elias, she said it the way you try a word in a different language, testing whether it holds what you expect. You ride circuit alone. I do. By choice or by circumstance. I looked at the fire. Little of both, I suppose. She nodded slowly, not like she'd learned something new, more like she'd confirmed something she'd already filed. You're good with children, she said. I had not especially demonstrated this yet, so I said so. You didn't flinch, she said. Some men flinch. They see a woman with this many children and they start looking for a way to not be standing there anymore. She glanced at the wagon, at the 12 sleeping shapes sorted by size. You just went to work. I didn't have an answer to that wasn't self-congratulation, so I said nothing. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. In the firelight, her face was 40 years old and 100 years old at the same time, not worn out, just lived in. The way a good knife looks when it's been used for what it's made for. Well, she said, we'll make the crossing by noon tomorrow if the water's where you say it is. It's where I say it is. She stood. Good night, Ilias. Let me tell you about the children. I'll tell you because if I try to tell the rest of this without you knowing them, the rest won't make sense. Samuel was 15. He'd stepped into the man-shaped hole his father left and was carrying it the way young men do, without complaining, without acknowledging it. With a set to his jaw I recognized because I'd worn it myself once. He watched me the first day and a half the way a foreman watches a new hand, waiting to see whether I was going to be useful or whether I was going to be in the way. Sometime around midday of the second day, he stopped watching me that way. I noticed when he stopped because the relief was physical, even though I hadn't noticed the weight of it until it was gone. Thomas was 13. He talked more than Samuel, thought more than he talked, and had a gift for mechanical problems that was already better than mine and would probably be remarkable by the time he was 20. He fixed the cracked spoke himself on the second morning with a piece of iron hoop and a length of rawhide, and I looked at it afterward and couldn't find anything I'd have done differently. Ruth was 11 and the most frightening of the lot in the best sense. She had her mother's stillness and her father's pamphlet-reading optimism somehow, and she was the one who woke before dawn to check on the horses, and the one who distributed the food, and the one who, when the 4-year-old, his name was Ezra, had a crying jag on the second afternoon, sat beside him and said 4 quiet words that stopped it, and the 4 words were I will never know what. Then there was Miriam 9, Margaret 8, Joseph 7, Caleb 6, Ezra 4. And the baby, not the twins, the one just before them, her name was Hannah. She was 14 months. And she rode most of the second day on my back because the wagon was bumping and she'd had enough of the wagon. And she fell asleep there with both fists in my coat collar and her chin on my shoulder. And I kept very still so as not to wake her. And Thomas saw this and said nothing, and Samuel saw this and said nothing. But there was something in the quality of how they both didn't say anything that felt like information. The twins were James and Peter. Eleanor had named them before she saw them after an uncle and her husband's father. James was 8 pounds and certain of himself. Peter was 6 pounds and uncertain of nothing. They were 4 weeks old. They slept and ate and regarded the world with the calm ferocity of individuals who have no reason yet to doubt that it will provide. The crossing was where I said it would be. We got the wagon over in one attempt, which surprised me because the roan gelding, not Calder, the other one, his name was Abel, had opinions about moving water that he expressed by stopping, and I'd expected more of a conversation. What actually happened was Samuel walked out into the current first, up to his thighs without breaking stride, and Abel watched this and decided if a 15-year-old was going to do it, then there was no longer a strong case for not doing it, and he went. I spent most of the crossing in the water myself, at the rear wheel, keeping it off a submerged rock I knew was there. The water was snowmelt cold. I did not mention this because it was not going to improve by being mentioned. Eleanor drove. She drove that wagon over a flooded creek with 2 newborns in a box behind her and 8 children sorted on the seat and bed. And she drove it the way she did everything, without theatrics, without visible fear, with a precision of attention that was so complete it was almost a physical thing, like you could see it. One moment she glanced back at the twins, and it was just a fraction of a second, and then her eyes were forward again. We came up the bank on the other side. Thomas said quietly, "Well done, Mama." She didn't look at him. She was already checking the harness. The claim was 8 miles north of the crossing. There was a cabin. This was the thing Eleanor had been most uncertain about. The letter from the county land office had said there was a structure on the claim, which could mean almost anything. What was there was a cabin built of cottonwood logs with a sod roof that it held, a stone fireplace that it held, a well that was good, and a barn that was mostly there in the sense that 3 walls and a roof section are mostly a barn. Clarence's pamphlet had described it as a settled homestead, and Clarence had not been wrong exactly. It had been settled at some point by someone who had then unsettled themselves, and what they'd left was the bones of something that could be made into something again. Eleanor stood in the door of the cabin for about 30 seconds. I stood behind her. Inside there was a plank floor, a broken chair, a rusted stove, and something that had been an animal at some point and was now just evidence. The smell was the smell of a place that has been closed for a long time and remembers it. She said, "It's sound." Then she turned around and started assigning children to tasks with the precision of a general redistributing troops after an unexpected terrain feature. And within 20 minutes the door was open. The former animal had been removed. Samuel and Thomas were measuring the barn walls. Ruth had located 2 of the 4 remaining window frames, and Caleb was asleep again on a piece of canvas in the yard, apparently having contributed his maximum to the enterprise and now resting. I did not leave. I want to be clear again about what this was and what it wasn't. It wasn't that I was lovesick. I had been lovesick once at 23 over a woman in Ohio who I had eventually understood did not see me the way I saw her, and the memory of that particular brand of foolishness was sufficient to last me. This was not that. It was something quieter. It was that I looked at what was in front of me, a woman and 12 children trying to do an enormous thing with insufficient tools in a country that didn't care whether they managed it or not, and I could not make myself be the one who rode away. That was all. I couldn't do it. And there was something else, if I'm being honest. There was the fact that she had not once asked me to stay. She'd accepted help when help was practical. She'd drunk the coffee because she needed coffee. She'd told me the crossing would work because I'd said it would because she needed the information. But she'd never asked me to stay, and she hadn't expected me to stay, and when I unsaddled Deuteronomy and turned him out in the linta beside Calder, she saw it and her face did something very small, and then she went back to work. That small thing on her face, I kept that. The county seat was 12 miles east. I left at first light on the 3rd morning, alone on Deuteronomy, and I was back by mid-afternoon with 3 things Eleanor Marsh needed and had not asked me to get. The first was a man named Hector Baines, who owed me a debt that was 14 months old and was a carpenter by trade. He brought his son, who was also a carpenter. They looked at the barn, said several things to each other that were too technical for me to follow, and began. By the time I left 4 days later, the barn was a barn. The second was the county registrar's confirmation that the deed was properly recorded and that there was no competing claim. Eleanor had the letter, but the letter was from before Clarence died, and she'd been worried, in the specific way of someone who has been let down by paperwork before, that something had gone wrong in the interval. Nothing had. I had the confirmation in writing with the county seal, and I put it in her hand, and she read it twice, and she said, "Thank you." And what I heard under those 2 words was a weight being set down that she had been carrying for 6 weeks. The third thing was the minister's record. I am a preacher. It is the one thing I am in a way that has no convenient exit, even when I was running from it, and I ran from it for about 4 years from 26 to 30, it kept finding me. It finds me in the way trouble finds honest men, which is to say not because they look for it, but because the thing is in their nature and nature doesn't consult you about its plans. What Eleanor Marsh had were 12 children, 10 of whom had been baptized in Missouri before Clarence's health changed and the traveling stopped. 2 of them had not. The twins had been born in the wrong month in the wrong county, and the record was a gap, and a gap in a minister's record in this country in this year is the kind of thing that compounds. It becomes other gaps. It becomes questions about legal standing. It becomes, in the worst case, years from now, a grandchild with no paper. I had not said this to Eleanor. I had not needed to. She'd said it to me on the second night, matter-of-factly, while she was nursing one twin and the other was against my chest because she'd needed a hand free and I was the hand available. She'd said, "The twins aren't recorded." And her voice had been flat and dry the way her voice always was, but there was something behind it. I had said, "I can do that." She'd looked at me. "It's my job," I said. "Your circuit," she said. "This isn't your county." I have standing in 3 counties and an arrangement with Reverend Aldous Pyle, who has standing in a 4th. I can do this. She had not said yes immediately. She sat for a moment with the nursing twin and the firelight in that face of hers. Then she said, "All 12. The record ought to be complete." "Elias," she said my name the way she'd said it the first night, testing it. "Those children were baptized by a proper minister in a proper church in Missouri." "I know it." We'll re-record them here in the county register with a notation of the original baptisms. The record here will be what matters here." She was quiet. "Eleanor," I said, "let me do this one thing. The morning of the 4th day." I know it doesn't sound like much when I say it now. I know that a baptism, 12 times over in a cleared yard by a well in the territory, is not what most people picture when they picture a sacrament. There was no font. There was a wooden bucket and a tin cup and a piece of linen Eleanor produced from somewhere in the wagon with the calm authority of a woman who has always known exactly where the piece of linen is. There was a sycamore's worth of shade on one side, and a lot of flat, pale sky on the other side, and the smell of sage and horse and new-cut lumber from where Hector Baines and his son were working on the barn. I had the county minister's register, a proper bound volume purchased that morning from the county clerk, who had been puzzled by the request and then philosophical about it. It would go back to the county seat when I left, with the entries complete. The children came in order. Samuel first, because Eleanor started with the oldest, working toward the twins at the end. Samuel stood in front of me with his hands at his sides and his jaw at the angle I'd come to know, that young man carrying something angle, and I said the words and put the water on his forehead, and in the register I wrote his full name and the date and the names of his parents. Eleanor Jane Marsh, née Pollard. Clarence William Marsh, deceased, February 1874. And for each child after that, Thomas, Ruth, Miriam, Margaret, Joseph, Caleb, Ezra, Hannah, and then the twins last, I wrote it the same way. The same parents. The same date of death. Deceased, February 1874. I wrote it 11 more times after Samuel, and by the end the repetition of it had become its own kind of weight, and I was glad I'd chosen a register with good paper, because my hand was going harder than I intended. Thomas watched everything. Margaret asked me 3 questions during her own baptism, which I answered, and then she seemed satisfied. Caleb almost fell asleep and was saved by Ruth's elbow. Ezra went through it twice because he hadn't been paying attention the first time, and I thought he should know it had happened. Hannah was perfect in the way that 14-month-olds are perfect. She had no opinion about ceremony and no judgment about the tin cup, and she looked at my face afterward with the frank assessment of very small children, and apparently decided I was acceptable. Then the twins. Eleanor brought James first. He was wrapped in white cloth she'd been saving. I understood from the particular way she handled it for this. She put him in my arms, not the way you hand someone a bundle, the way you hand someone a thing that matters, and she stepped back 1 step. I did the words. James regarded me with the calm certainty of his character, and I wrote his name in the register and the date and the names of his parents and the words deceased, February 1874, and I gave him back to Eleanor. Peter was smaller in my hands. He looked up at me from the white cloth and his face did something uncertain, the way his face always did, like he was still deciding about the world. I did the words. I wrote his name. I wrote his father's name and the date of his father's death one final time and closed the register. I looked up. Eleanor was watching me. She had both twins now, one to each side, the way I had first seen her in the road, tilted wagon and flat mean sun. Except now we were here in this yard with the barn going up behind us and the 12 children sorted around us and the sage smell and the pale sky. She said nothing for a moment. Then she walked the 2 steps toward me and she put one hand against my chest, palm flat, and she looked at me. Not at the collar, not past me at something more important. At me, the man standing in front of her. She said, "Elias Cutter." I said, "Eleanor." She said, 12, one word. I said 12. She left her hand there for a beat longer than was necessary. Her eyes were very steady, and there was something in them I had not seen before, in 4 days of watching her. Not softness, exactly, because Eleanor Marsh was not a soft woman and would not thank you for calling her one, but something open. The door she kept closed, cracked just slightly. Then Ruth said, from the other side of the yard, in the specific tone of an 11-year-old who has noticed something and has decided everyone else should notice it too, "Mama." And Eleanor stepped back. I stayed 2 more weeks. I should have gone. Reverend Aldous Pyle's letters were becoming pointed. My circuit wasn't writing itself. Deuteronomy was developing an attitude about the Linta that expressed itself as periodic commentary at 3 in the morning. I stayed because the barn roof wasn't done when Hector Baines and his son left, and there were 4 places I could see from the ground that needed to be right before winter. and because Thomas needed a hand on the post holes for the corral, and because the stove in the cabin had a cracked firebox that someone with a basic knowledge of metalwork could fix, and I had a basic knowledge of metalwork. These were the reasons. They were true reasons. They were also not the whole of the reason, and Alina knew it, and she said nothing about it, which was itself a kind of answer. We worked, that was what we did. We worked from before light until the light was gone, and then we ate what Ruth cooked. And Ruth could cook, in the plain, filling, no-nonsense way of someone who learned it as a matter of survival, and then discovered she was good at it. And after the children were sorted into their sleeping places, I sat at the table with Alina while she nursed whichever twin needed it, and we talked. About what you ask, about everything and nothing, about the county and the land, about what the soil would take and what it wouldn't. About the school situation, which was no school, there being no teacher within 14 miles, and about Ruth's reading, which was several years ahead of her age, and about whether Samuel was going to run himself into the ground by spring if no one gave him permission to rest sometimes. About a man in the Southern Territory I'd preached it 2 years ago whose well had failed, and who'd lost everything and what he'd done about it, and whether it was possible to prevent that here. About Clarence, some evenings, though not often and not long, Alina was not a woman who visited grief as entertainment. She'd been there and come back, and she kept the door to it short-latched, opened only when necessary. One night she said, "What did you run from?" I looked at her. She said, "You said little of both. When I asked about riding circuit alone, you said choice and circumstance." I had not thought she was still carrying that. I had said it in the first camp as something to say, or so I'd thought. I told her, it took longer than I expected. The circuit, the church in Ohio, the woman in Ohio, the 4 years I'd spent trying to be something other than a preacher, and the mounting evidence that I was not going to succeed at this. The way I'd come west thinking that was different from coming west running, and the way I'd eventually understood that those two things were the same thing. The way I'd stopped running around 30 because I got tired, and because Reverend Pyle had given me a circuit that needed doing, and it turned out that doing a thing that needed doing was, for me, the cure for most of what was wrong with me. Alina listened to all of it. She was nursing Peter. She said nothing until I was done, and then she said, "You stayed." "I know it." "I don't mean here," she said. "I mean in general you stopped running." "I did." She looked down at Peter, who had fallen asleep against her, and then she looked at me. "Clarence ran," she said. "Not from me, from staying in one place when it stopped suiting him. That's what the pamphlet was. I knew it. I still went." She paused. "I don't mean that badly. He was a good man. He just couldn't. He needed the next thing. Always needed the next thing." She shifted Peter slightly. "I am finished with men who need the next thing." I did not say anything. She said, "I'm telling you that, Ilias, in case it matters. I will tell you about the last morning, because it is the one that is clearest." Deuteronomy, demonstrating what I can only interpret as a capacity for timing, had been quiet all night, which suggested he'd known we were leaving and had no objection to this for once in his life. The circuit was waiting. Reverend Pyle was waiting. 3 settlements east of here were waiting for a Sunday service, and one of them had a couple who needed marrying and had been waiting for 3 weeks and deserved better than they'd gotten. Samuel loaded my saddlebags without being asked. He was not a demonstrative young man, I've said this, but he did it with a care that was its own statement. Thomas came and checked my stirrup leather, which did not need checking, and said it needed checking, and adjusted it by a fraction, and did not look at me while he was doing it. Ruth came out and handed me a cloth package that proved to be 6 biscuits and a piece of pork, and she said, "For the road." And I said, "Thank you, Ruth." And she said, "You're welcome, Reverend Cutter," which was the first time any of the children had called me that, and it went somewhere unexpected. Caleb was asleep. Ezra gave me a rock. He'd been carrying it in his pocket for 2 days, I learned later, waiting to give it to me. It was a piece of red sandstone with a stripe of white quartz through it that was, in his estimation, the finest rock in the territory. I put it in my breast pocket. I still have it. The quartz stripe runs diagonal, and when the light hits it a certain way, it almost looks like something. Hannah held her arms up, and I took her for a minute, and she put her chin on my shoulder again the way she had on the road, and then she decided she was done, and I put her down. Alina came out of the cabin. She had the twins, one to each side, and she walked to where I was standing by Deuteronomy, and she stopped a foot in front of me. We had not said anything final the previous night. We had talked about the water yield of the well in late summer and about a passage in the book of Ruth that I'd mentioned and that she'd asked me to find in my Bible, which I had, and she'd read it twice. Nothing final. We were people who understood that the final things didn't need rehearsing. She said, "You'll come back through." "I will." She said, "I'm not asking you to." I said, "I know it." She said, "I'm saying I know you will. That's different." I looked at her. She looked at me that same way she'd looked at me in the yard after the baptisms, at me, not past me, not at the collar. The door cracked open the same careful fraction. She said, "James and Peter are in the county register." "They are. All 12. All 12. She was quiet. The wind came off the flats and moved her hair. James stirred against her, and she shifted her arm without looking down, with the automatic grace of a woman who has been doing this for 15 years. "Ilya's," she said. "Eleanor's." She leaned forward and she put her forehead against mine. Just for a moment. Just the 3 seconds it took. Her eyes were closed and mine were open, and I could see the lines at the corners of her eyes and a strand of hair that had come loose and the twins between us, warm and alive, and the barn Hector Baines had built standing behind her in the early light. Then she straightened. She stepped back. Her face was the face I'd first seen in the road, composed, specific, undefeated. "Come back through," she said. "I will," I said. That was the whole of it. I rode east on Deuteronomy, who moved with what might have been, for him, something approaching willingness. The sun was just up and the alkali flats were pale and flat in the early light, and I had 6 biscuits and a piece of pork and a piece of red sandstone in my pocket. And behind me there was a cabin with a good stove and a barn with a sound roof, and a deed properly recorded and a register in the county seat with 12 names written in my hand. And I did not look back, because I already knew what was there. I would come back through in September. I came back through in September. But that's a different telling, and you've heard enough for now.